Thank you all for being here today. I'm thrilled to be having this conversation. Um, my name is Nava Haghighi. I'm a doctoral candidate here at Stanford in the Computer Science Department, Human-Computer Interaction Group. And my research is around human-centered AI. It's my absolute honor to introduce our esteemed guests, Professors Lucy Suchman and Professor Terry Winograd, both of whose work has fundamentally, in more than one way, transformed, changed, and expanded the fields of AI and human-computer interaction. I'll just touch on a few. Lucy Suchman is Professor Emerita of the Anthropology of Science and Technology at Lancaster University in the UK. She was previously a principal scientist at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, where she spent 20 years as a researcher. Her current research extends her longstanding and pioneering critical engagement with the fields of artificial intelligence and human-computer interaction to the domain of contemporary militarism. She's the author of Human-Machine Reconfigurations and Plans and Situated Actions, and has received the ACM Sikai Lifetime Research Award and the John Desmond Bernal Prize from the Society for Social Studies of Science. What makes Lucy's work particularly unique, and this is true of her early work, and if you were at her talk yesterday, you would feel the same, is that it's not just critique. Instead, through deep engagement with technology and its social and material conditions, she reveals how the questions being asked are too narrow, making room for imagining systems differently. Her approach has, in turn, shaped new ways for technical practitioners to contribute to critical discourse. For example, it literally shaped critical technical practice. For anyone who knows Phil Agri, who coined the term, Lucy got him, or was one of the two people credited with getting him to read Heidegger and Garfinkel, among probably many other things. But that set him on a path that transformed his work and many of ours with it. So thank you, Lucy. Terry Winograd is Professor Emeritus in the Computer Science Department at Stanford University. During his 40 years of teaching and research in the Computer Science Department, he created and directed the Human-Computer Interaction Group, where I'm currently a member of, and the teaching and research program in Human-Computer Interaction Design at Stanford. He was a founding faculty member of the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, also known as the D School, has received the ACM Sikai Lifetime Research Award, and is a distinguished fellow of Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, or HI. He's been a consultant to a number of companies, for example, one founded by Stanford students from his projects, Google. During his PhD program at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab in the 1960s, Terry did pioneering research in AI, in particular natural language understanding. Then he became famously disillusioned with the direction of AI research in the late 1970s because it narrowly focused on symbol manipulation while ignoring human social practices, embodiment, and context. Terry's seminal book with Fernando Flores, Understanding Computers and Cognition, builds on critiques of cognitivism and brings phenomenology, for example, into AI research, which consequently transforms a human in human-computer interaction and opens it up for many new possibilities. I encountered Terry's work in my first year of the PhD program, where I likely let out a small shriek of excitement when I spotted the term ontological design and phrases like, in designing tools, we are designing ways of being, in a book co-authored by a computer scientist. I'm also honored to call Terry a mentor. Thank you, Terry. In the event today, the conversation will be around two historic events involving Lucy and Terry and the relevance of those events to the AI developments today. One in collaboration between the two of them and the other in dialogue. In collaboration, Lucy and Terry were both founding members of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, or CPSR, which was formed in response to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense, or Star Wars initiative, and the proposal for computer control of nuclear weapon systems. The seeds of CPSR were planted in 1981, first as a discussion group, and finally more formalized as CPSR in 1983. Speaking of pioneering. We will reflect on this history in the context of political events today. In dialogue, While both Lucy and Terry have expanded the possibilities of both critical and technical practice, their positions sometimes diverge, most notably in the coordinator debate, which culminated in a debate collection in the CSCW journal with contributions from the community. And CSCW is computer-supported collaborative work. While I'm sure threads related to the content of this dialogue are going to make their way into our conversation today, what I find most powerful about that conversation is what Lucy herself described in her response as not ad hominem attacks or competing truth claims that divide us into insiders and outsiders, but a way to acknowledge and make room for discordant voices. As Lucy continues in the closing paragraph of her response to the CSCW issue, Terry's understanding computers and cognition opened doors for many. Lucy's work opened that door further, and I'd argue that this was only possible because of the friction that they co-created, grounded in what Lucy notes as her enduring friendship with and admiration for Terry Winograd. I met Lucy at a critical computing conference this summer, 2 months ago. When Lucy told me that she'll be at Stanford giving a talk in October, I couldn't resist but to ask her if she would be interested in having a conversation with Terry. She did not think for a second and said, absolutely, and immediately noted how dear of a friend Terry is. When I asked Terry about the conversation, he said the same. I share this because this exchanges that they had and the resulting conversations through and beyond the CSCW volume exemplify generative friction, not one to shy away from or smooth over, but one to stay with and to look for and not to look for the easy way out of. Their debate remains deeply relevant to today's most pressing issues in AI development, hard to solve and important to stay with. Friction is powerful when it can expand imagination by making visible what might escape our attention, and maybe less so when it contracts. The resonance of this kind of expansive friction can be seen in many places, in both Lucy and Terry's work, individually, in collaboration, and in dialogue. In a world full of frictions, and at times when we may feel contracted, it's an honor to explore friction's expansive generativity with you both. With that, I will thank you once again for being here, and I'll give you the floor for your introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you. Good, I'm on. First, of course, I just really want to thank Nava for pulling together, for seeing the possibility of having this event, and then offering us both the opportunity. It's a great opportunity for me to reconnect with Lucy after probably quite a few years since we've actually been together, and to use the friction, as you say, as an way to get to understanding. So it's a really a blessing, a real great opportunity that I'm appreciative of. So I'm going to just give a couple of context-setting remarks, and then we'll get into the discussion. Nowadays, when people say, oh, Terry, would you like to give a speech? What's it about? AI, right? They say, you're an expert on AI. You should be telling us what we're doing and what's happening and all that. And I do some of those, but my first comment is, I really don't understand the kind of AI they do today. Right? I did AI back in the dim, dark ages when it was representational. It's what John Hoagland called good old-fashioned AI, GoFi, which had the basic principle that anything you wanted to have the computer do, you had to have an explicit understanding and representation of what it knew and how it was reasoning. And you built that into your programs. As opposed to today's AI, which has they're now adding them together, but the whole original push for large language models and GPT and all that was we don't have any model of what's going on. We just let it go through huge amounts of data, come up with correlations, and then see what it does. Right? And I'm sure all of you are aware of that general paradigm. And I don't, as I said, I have no technical mathematical understanding of how that's done. I just read it in the public press. On the other hand, what I say second is the social issues around AI have stayed very much the same. Even though the technology is doing different things, the problems that it can cause, the things that people hope for, the hype, we've seen them all before, right? It's there. So how do we translate the kinds of thinking that we were doing in those days into today's world and see where that leads us as to what can be done about it? And so that's my current direction. And the things that Nava mentioned in the past that Lucy and I have worked on are really still central focus issues. So as she said, CPSR got started in the Reagan era with the attempt to disavow politicians and military people of the false security idea that you could build an invulnerable shield to prevent being attacked by missiles. And of course, why would you want to? Because then you could be the other guy and be safe, right? It was a war-fighting posture. It wasn't really a defensive posture. And I mean, are you going to do your slide of the Golden Dome?
No, are we not? Yes. Okay, but I'm going to talk about Golden.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, what's so ironic is within the past year, that entire thing has simply been resurrected but coated in gold, right? We have an even crazier president. I mean, so the idea that artificial intelligence can save us militarily and give us military edge, all those things, is a very big part of the public discourse. We have to get it before China does, all those things. And there's the larger context to that. And I did go to Lucy's talk yesterday and really appreciated her framing of it in terms of the closed world of military thinking. That what the AI boom is doing is reinforcing what Paul Edwards called the closed world assumptions of the military. And I'll let her talk more about that. She's an expert on it. I just went to her talk. The other is workplace. All right, so one of the very first areas that CPSR got involved in was what do computers do to workers, to the workplace, to what we do every day. And we drew on things like the participatory design tradition from Scandinavia, which was very important and still present at the conference you went to in Aarhus. And it's very much the question today. I mean, everybody's talking about AI is going to take all our jobs. And that's hype. It's a way to sell it. I understand that. But in terms of what it really means to have it do the jobs, I think we can draw on Lucy's work from way back when, plans and situated actions, to use the title of her book then, which says, don't think of the work as what you see on the forms that people do. The work is going on behind that. And the AI can do a pretty good job of what's on the forms. But that's not replacing work. And then what are the economic and social pressures that are pushing for work? So I'll stop there. But these two issues, the military assumptions and the workplace assumptions, I think are very much today's world.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Great. So is my mic still working even though I dropped it on the floor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I want to just echo the sense of what an enormous pleasure it is to be in conversation with Terry, and how much admiration I have for Terry. And so I was going to talk about what I see as maybe 3 areas of intersection between our work. But before I start, I just wanted to point out, some of you may notice that I have a sticker on my laptop that says, AI is not inevitable. And just in case any of you noticed that, I want to invite you to ask me about it. It's kind of a provocation, and I'd be really happy to talk about it. But so as Terry said, I think the intersections of our engagements are our respective engagements with AI, beginning in the 1970s, 1960s.
60s for me, yeah.
Yeah. And also our shared interests in the limits of AI, particularly with respect to language understanding, if we take the understanding part seriously, and communication. And the through lines, as Terry was saying, through lines and significant changes in terms of generative AI. And I'm aware that this conversation was advertised as a conversation about AI. And so again, like if we start, straying off into areas that don't feel directly enough relevant, then by all means, call us back. But I was really interested to see in the announcement of this talk, which there's a topic that says generative AI. And I found that fascinating because, of course, we have the word generative in the title, generative frictions. I assume that generative got picked up on. And I think, in a way, one of the things that is really interesting to think about is the sense of generative that I think about in terms of our conversation today and generative AI. So I thought that our talk was categorized as an example, where its central topic is generative AI was, indicative, shall we say. And then, so that's one point of intersection. A second one, as Terry mentioned, concerns about the increasing automation of weapon systems. Back in the day, nuclear weapon systems, which unfortunately now we have to worry about again. And then particularly proposals under Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative for so-called launch on warning, which is basically computer control of the detection of incoming missiles and the initiation of a response. And then, getting involved in the founding of CPSR, and then research on design and particularly work-oriented design. So I'm just going to say a few words about each of those. So for me, this started in my engagement as a PhD student at Xerox PARC, starting in around 1980, with AI and then really just emerging field of HCI. The whole idea of interactive computing was like very, very new then. And I was interested in the context of the planning model, which was the dominant kind of paradigm at the time in AI, with articulating what I think about as the differences that matter between prescriptive representations, I'm going to say, as a category, that are developed and then put to use in human activities. So plans, instructions, recipes, procedures, all of those things we can think about as prescriptive representations. The differences that matter between those and executable algorithms. So that was one of the things I was interested in, and the kind of elision of those differences that I saw going on among my colleagues. And then in the context of human-machine interaction, again, in the differences that matter between the resources that are available to us as we co-construct our mutual intelligibility, in an always kind of just good enough for the purposes at hand way. So that on the one hand, and the resources available to computational systems, which are basically, the sensor data input that they have access to that get read through whatever models they have of what those might mean. So again, and that all with the aim of producing intelligible output. So the differences in what it means to, what we get to draw on in trying to understand each other, and I would argue, very limited sensory input on which computational systems have to rely in the production of something intelligible. And those sort of lines of analysis came together in my dissertation as plans and situated actions, thinking about that relationship and the problem of human-machine communication. So sort of bringing together those, the AI and the HCI kinds of issues, and I'm happy to talk more about that. And then CPSR, which started out as a distribution list at PARC called Anti-War Up Arrow, the up arrow being, some of you will recognize that. So Anti-War Up Arrow, which was started by Severo Ornstein, who had worked on the SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment, which was the first missile defense shield starting in the 1950s that was designed to protect North America from incoming missiles. So Severo had worked on SAGE, and the context in the early 1980s was the Cold War, and this rapidly escalating arms race between the US and the Soviet Union, which then led to Ronald Reagan's proposal for the Strategic Defense, or so-called Star Wars initiative. And Severo proposed that we needed an organization of computer scientists to supplement work that was being done by the Union of Concerned Scientists, a much broader physicists and others, Physicians for Social Responsibility, which was another international organization. And the argument was that we both, CPSR, and actually Terry organized the first meeting here at Stanford. And I remember we had a debate about what to name the organization, because initially the idea was to call it Computer Scientists for Social Responsibility. But then there was a discussion about whether that would be too narrow and would exclude people who should be involved. So the word professionals was taken instead. So both to get conversations going on within the computing professions, and at Park we had a reading group because nobody there was an expert in nuclear weapon systems or the computational infrastructures for that. So we had a reading group to educate ourselves and talk about it, and then also to make some relevant professional expertise available into public discussion, resources that computer professionals could bring that nobody else was in a position to bring. And again, I could talk more about that. David Parnas, very importantly, was involved in that and made really crucial arguments about reliability based on the impossibility of testing the system under real-world conditions. Brian Cantwell-Smith, who we also would like to remember here, wrote a wonderful paper called The Limits of Correctness, and be glad to talk more about that as well. And then also there was an associated strategic computing plan initiative coming out of DARPA at the same time. And Severo and Brian and I wrote a piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists where we critiqued that. It was published in 1985, so we're talking 40 years ago. And I think the parallels to current, the proposals for current AI-enabled weapon systems are really striking. So there was autonomous vehicles for the Army, a pilot's associate for the Air Force, and a battle management system for the Navy. And I have a little quote here from the initiative. So they imagined there would be, quote, completely autonomous land, sea, and air vehicles capable of complex, far-ranging reconnaissance and attack missions. So for any of you who have been following contemporary developments in the automation of weapon systems, this will be very familiar. So then Golden Dome, in January of this year, Donald Trump issued an executive order establishing the program. It's to protect North America against long-range weapons, including ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missiles capable of striking the U.S. with either conventional or nuclear warheads. And it includes space-based interceptors and sensors. And of course, speed necessitates automation in the conceptualization of this system. And the idea is that this kind of system of systems would have a kind of seamless integration, but again, the premise is that its reliability would require on end-to-end testing, and the same kinds of questions that David Parnas raised come up here again. And this is in the context where Secretary of War Hegseth and Trump have cut 74% of the staff who at the office that would oversee such testing, right? So there's also some debate about the cost. So in the big, beautiful bill, there $25 billion is allocated for this for fiscal year 2026. Trump has said the project will cost $175 billion. The Congressional Budget Office said it would likely cost as much as $542 billion, and defense experts that have been cited by the New York Times estimate the cost at over $1 trillion. So it's a bit of uncertainty there. In an industry day last August, Defense One, which is a media outlet that I follow, reports that, quote, AI is expected to play a central role in the Golden Dome air defense system, from helping to integrate sensors and interceptors to accelerating the detection and tracking of threats. And we can imagine that companies like Palantir are now going to be entering the picture to integrate all of the data. And the New York Times reported in May of this year, quote, Mr. Trump said he was confident that the United States could complete the project in about 3 years and be, quote, fully operational before the end of my term. And he called it, quote, as close to perfect as you can have. I'm sure you're all very reassured by that. And then finally, to go to the question of design and work-oriented design, and again, Terry mentioned that for me, a critical piece of this, it's about thinking about the ways in which the automation of work requires its representation in ways that simplify and erase crucial aspects of the labor, and that because you have to simplify or model skills in ways that can't actually incorporate everything that's involved. And for me, being very inspired by alternative practices of design emerging in Scandinavia in the 1970s, where there were trade unions that were resourced well enough that they could not just kind of defend against, loss of jobs and de-skilling, but they could actually collaborate with a network of computer science graduate students who had some fairly progressive ideas about this, to create prototype systems for, what would it look like to create a system, for example, for newspaper workers. They worked with the union, and this is sort of the beginning of graphical workstations, to work with the newspaper workers who had been doing, say, layout, to develop works information systems that were skill enhancing, preserving quality of working life, and so forth. So they were doing these cooperative design projects, and the group that we had at Xerox PARC, called Work Practice and Technology, basically what we did was we tried to see what versions of that kind of participatory design we could do in the context of a place like PARC and Silicon Valley and so forth. So we did a whole series of projects about that. And and so I think I'll leave it there, and again, glad to talk more about any of
If you don't mind, I want to just take one more minute to go back and talk about Brian Cantwell Smith. He just died very recently. And I knew him from the time he was an undergraduate at MIT. I was a graduate student there. And he was working with Joe Weizenbaum, who I'll probably end up mentioning later, is really a pioneer in thinking about the social impacts of computing. And then he was at Xerox PARC for many years, but along with that, he taught a lot at Stanford. So he had a number of courses and was very involved in the symbolic systems program, and was really a force for thinking. And the unique thing about him really was he had this combination of philosophy and computing. That is, he understood the technology deeply. He was an MIT undergraduate, right? And he really knew that. And at the same time, he was really thoughtful about the deeper philosophical issues. And I actually see that Mike Dixon's here, who was one of his students. So that's great that we can build on what he did for all those years and remember his contribution.
Thank you both. Wow, there's so much to start with, and I have to pick. So I think what I'll ask is probably what a lot of us think when we read both of your books. If you were to write those books right now, what, if anything, might be different about how you think about and talk about the social aspects of AI? And just to like give a little starting hint, you know, I can imagine, and I've had conversations with my colleagues about this, right? Like imagining what does it mean in the context of AI systems today? You know, Lucy, I would say it's probably a lot less, you know, explicitly planning oriented. I wouldn't go as far as saying like planning isn't happening, right? So like I would love for you to maybe tell us a bit about where is like what if anything would change there. And Terry, you have a quote that maybe you were gonna use, but I'm now gonna say, is you say computers don't give a damn, and I wonder if you think that's any different now, or you know, take that any direction you may, but maybe these are just some starting thoughts.
Okay. Which order?
You,
I'll start. Okay. If I were writing, if you look back at what we said, this is actually in the early 80s when the drafts were being done, but by the mid 80s when I got published, it said artificial intelligence as it is now conceived is based on a false ontology. It's based on this notion I said earlier of representation, of explicit reasoning, and all that. And there are a lot of good philosophical background and reasons to realize that that is not going to work. I mean, we drew a lot on the work of Hubert Dreyfus, who died again a few years ago in Berkeley, taught at Berkeley for many, many years. He drew in turn on phenomenology and Heidegger and so on. But my knowledge, when you say, what do you know about Heidegger? I say, I got it all from Dreyfus, right? I know his version of the translation. But what we said in a kind of a side note was, this wouldn't apply if you don't have representations and you just have something like neural networks. Huh. But of course, that's not going to work. and so I mean, it was really like a toss away that, okay, we have nothing to say if you don't have explicit representation. Today, you can't toss it away, right? That is, the whole foundation of AI today is not on explicit representation, but is on correlation of huge amounts of data. And again, you're here where everybody understands that stuff, but it's a very different approach. And I think we couldn't have just sidestepped it that way. So then the question would have been, how do you bring the critique to bear when that's not there? So to take your quote, John Hoagland, who was a student of Dreyfus, actually, and taught for many years in Pittsburgh, had a famous aphorism, which actually was the title for a book of papers that people wrote in response to it, called Computers Don't Give a Damn. And the bottom line there is really what's the issue with AI of all sorts, which is when I deal with you, we use language, we use various kinds of communication, we both do things, but I have the basic assumption that underneath you care about something. It's not just hollow. And with AI, it really doesn't care about anything. I mean, it's just not built in. You can add things for it to talk about what it cares about, but that's an overlay, right? That's saying, well, this is what I would think, but it isn't really caring. And I think the underlying problems in all these applications and all the ways that computers are being used is recognizing that you have to put the computer in the context of a tool. You know, your hammer doesn't care what you hit, right? Not that it's necessarily bad if you use it in a way where that's the people putting it in place, your care, your concern, your intentionality is what's driving it. Which leads to another whole rat's nest of problems, which I don't know if we're going to get into, which is who actually controls this? Is it the companies? Is it the workers? Is it the users? Is it the, you know, it's a big question when you say people, it should care. I mean, I get, we can talk about this later if we want, the notion of alignment, right? People use that to say, well, it'll be okay if we can get the AI to align with human values. Whose human values, right? I mean, that's just a huge jump to say there is something called human values. And you don't need to go very far in the newspaper today to understand the great gaps that are there. So I think there's a big underlying issue there. I'll stop there and let Lucy go.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, because I think a lot about you know, what are the through lines that I think what do I think hasn't changed, and how to acknowledge what has changed. And you know, I'm interested to see how with the kind of reaching the limits of symbolic AI, and then the emergence of sufficient amounts of data and compute power to begin to do data-driven AI. And now as that is beginning to make evident some of its limits, now we have to bring some symbolic AI back in and hope that this hybrid will somehow exceed the limits that have been encountered in the efforts in both directions. But for me, the through lines are about the ways in which these both symbolic systems and data-driven systems rely on models, and those models are reliant on human labor and practices of interpretation at both the input and at the assessment of the output and the iterative sort of refinement of the processes that happen in between. So we're still dealing with a situation where the significance of what's being produced is a significance that is drawn from attributions of significance made by those involved in everything from figuring out where sensors are going to be set up, what the signals that are coming through those sensors, what their significance is, of labeling data, of assessing the coherence or intelligibility of output, of refining the models. All of that actual attribution of significance remains in the practices of the humans who are constructing these systems. And so while the techniques have changed radically, there is no more giving a damn, or no more meaning being actually registered directly by the technical systems that we're building. It's our ability to, and those are of course also where the problems arise. What informs the making of the data on which neural networks and deep learning systems and machine learning rely? What informs the making of those data? What are the politics of the making of those data? And I emphasize the making of those data, because if the talk I gave yesterday was very much about denaturalizing data and recognizing that data are not given by the world, but rather are made through translations of all kinds of signals into some kind of significant, signals into tokens, and then the results of the processing of those tokens into some kind of significant output. So what informs the making of the data? Who assesses the results, the resulting output, and what are the political economies that that keep this whole industry going? So those are sort of questions.
Just give one memorable quote from that talk. Raw data is an oxymoron.
Yes,
that was one thing.
Was actually Jeffrey Bowker, who some of you may know. But there's a very nice collection called "Raw Data is an Oxymoron," which is writing. And Jeff Bowker says raw data is an oxymoron and a bad idea. And what he means by that is, it is in the understanding of data production, of the manufacture of data, where so many of the key issues lie. But that is systematically marginalized in a lot of the discourse around data-intensive systems. It's just the sort of, as one of the diagrams I showed yesterday, the data sort of streams in, right? Usually from sort of the left-hand side, from the world outside the system, streams into the machinery of the data analytic machinery. But there, to me, kind of really all of the crucial stuff is in that formulation of computationally tractable input. That is where all of the translation goes on. That's where the, translation is a word that also means betrayal, because translation necessarily involves some losses, some revisions. So yeah, I think that's really a crucial piece of this.
Yeah, thanks both. That's really interesting, and I think in some ways, you talking about alignment and you talking about refinement, right? Like both of these are very human activities that are doing something in the world, and I think part of the critique is around who is doing that work. But I would also like to push on that a little bit and think about, thinking about expansive possibilities of friction. What else might there be? Just a casual question asking how else might we do AI, right? But really, I think both of your books did offer a different way of thinking about the status quo at the time. And so, a lot of people in this room are doing work on making AI better data practices, better labor practices. But I would, oftentimes you need to and are operating within the dominant paradigm in order to make it safer, to make it less harmful, at least. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on if we were to kind of move towards this acknowledgement that there is this level of human involvement in making these magical systems. Are there new possibilities that can also emerge?
I mean, I could take a stab at that. I think, to me, it's very much about appropriate domains of application. So I think that we need much more careful delineation of the appropriate domains of application of big data analytics and AI systems of the machine learning kind. And I think what defines those appropriate areas of application in part has to do, again, with data. So I'm thinking about AlphaFold, which is always held up as the sort of great positive example. And an interview that I heard with the biochemist who was part of the pair who won the Nobel Prize for AlphaFold. And I'm really sorry I don't remember his name, but I loved what he said because he was being interviewed. And the interviewer was very excited and said, AlphaFold shows that AI can do scientific discovery, and now we can imagine this happening in all areas of science. And he said, wait a minute, actually, I think AlphaFold is quite a unique case because you had a data set that had been curated over an extended period of time by a very large collective of people. And it was the quality and the care and the curation of that data set that then enabled the discoveries that were enabled through the technologies of AI. So, and he said, I can't think at the moment of any other comparable data sets. So I thought that was really interesting. Again, where else are there domains where the datafication of the problem that we're working on really makes sense? We understand, what's being gained and what's being lost, and where there is that kind of long-term. We might also think about climate modeling, right? Paul Edwards' book, A Vast Machine, about, again, the long-term collective, incredibly labor-intensive work of creating, curating, negotiating what constitutes the data for climate modeling. For me, that's kind of the critical question. And I think at this point, there's not nearly enough attention being paid to delineating those domains of application and what's required to actually create the kind of quality data sets that are necessary.
Yeah, let me take that in another direction too, which is if we look at what the public sees of AI, most of them don't follow Nobel Prizes in chemistry, right? Or in the Peace Prize, but that's another question.
Interesting, yeah.
But they see chatbots, It's not the only thing. They also see picture makers and a lot of other things, but they see chatbots. And again, and I'm at the age where I tend to say, well, what did somebody say about that 60 years ago, 70 years ago, whatever? And of course, Joe Weizenbaum, who I mentioned earlier, built the program called ELIZA, which most of you have probably come across, or maybe even written your own version of. I mean, it's so easy. Which was a chatbot. I mean, it was way ahead of its time in that sense, and it was very simplistic. But the point wasn't what it could do, but what people attributed to it. That is, people who interacted with it had the feeling it was really understanding them, based on really flimsy kinds of processes. So the point is, it's what you do with it and how you interpret what it is doing. If you say this is a clever phrase rearranger, that's fine. If you say it understands me, you're attributing. And we are, as a species, very prone to attribute human qualities to almost anything. My brother, who's sort of a nerd, used to talk about his refrigerator or his car or whatever, as though they were people, right? And that's not quite getting involved with a chatbot and having romantic fantasies and so on, but I don't think he had it about the refrigerator.
He wasn't that much of a nerd. Yeah.
He wasn't that much of a nerd. But that we don't really, you have to put, I mean, if I say, is it fine to have a AI program summarize the points in a meeting? I would say mostly yes. I mean, it's going to make mistakes, but if you hire somebody to do that, they'll make mistakes too. I mean, it's not like there's a standard of what's right. And if I attribute it to, okay, this is a mechanical summary, it's useful. If you say, should I have a human relationship with it about my life and romance and all that kind of stuff, that's where you've crossed that line from understanding what it really does to attributing what you would if it were a person doing it, but it isn't, it's a machine.
Yeah, I completely agree with you both in that in Lucy's case, thinking about these appropriate domains of application, and in your case, what what you build and what the public ends up seeing. I feel like a common thread between these is that it's maybe almost partly, at least, a design problem, right? Like we're designing these systems, or not necessarily a design problem, but a design possibility or threads that can kind of reveal possibilities through design. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of thoughts or musings on what could a different, set of imaginations look like for something else, or if you've come across it, if there's people you think are doing work that you can share with everyone, things that when you see you're like, okay, this is doing something a little differently.
Let me just make a comment on design.
Yeah.
You said that. This past weekend here on campus, there was a big 2-day celebration of the 20th anniversary of the D School, I mentioned earlier, the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, to give it its proper name. And a lot of people came, a lot of people have been very affected by it. And what I took away, and in many different ways, is understanding there is no such thing as a field of design. There is a design-oriented process.
Yeah.
And he kept saying over again, trust the process, do the process. That it's a way of approaching the thing you're building, which doesn't start with what are the pieces we can put together, but starts with what intervention is this going to make in people's lives? I mean, and so if that's what design means, then it is a design problem, as are many, many things in the world. And then the question is, how do you implement that? How do you create an environment where the questions you're asking start from what is the intervention going to be in people's lives? What lives are you designing, not what thing are you designing? And I think that the industry is not set up to do that. I think in academia you have individual projects like that, but they tend to be, quote, academic projects, right? So I think it's a big question of how to bring that sensibility about what are you doing for people into the pipeline.
Yeah, and maybe if I can just add to that, I mean, for me, a crucial question is who is the you? You know, what is the position of the designer in relation to those for whom the design is intended? And the critical question of who defines the problem? What is the problem for which this is a solution, and who defines that problem? And then to what extent is it predetermined that the solution is going to be a technological one? Or is there a genuine openness to, you know, a much wider range of possible solutions in which technology might have a place, but it might be a very humble and modest place. And so getting away from the kind of techno-solutionism that we are all just, you know, so deeply embedded in, I think is an opening up design to a much more heterogeneous set of media practitioners' approaches, to me, is a really crucial.
Right. I mean, to pick an obvious example of that question, look at climate. I mean, there are plenty of people who think climate is a problem, rising climate change, and we need technical solutions, and it's carbon dioxide capture or recycling or whatever it is. And you take a step back and you say, this is not a technical problem. Calling it a problem is, in fact, defining it, right? It is a social will, social involvement, what people care about, how they care about other people. And we need to go back and think of it at that level, not at the level of, can you get a better carbon capture device?
Right, and it's also a political and economic question. And the problem is that often the things that can be done where there's a return on investment, the things that can be done that will be profitable are the technological things. And the other things that involve social and political and economic redesign, it's not as clear how profitable they are. And I think about this very much in terms of militarism, that you know, militarism has completely taken over the space of possibility for international relations at the moment, particularly by the United States, and driven to the margins the possibilities for, you know, creative forms of diplomacy, of de-escalation, of negotiation. And I think it's not coincidental that those practices are much less profit generating than the investments in technological solutions or the building out of military technology. So we're caught in a political economic system where there are investments in both senses of that word in having the solutions be technological. And, you know, that's part of what we have to kind of live in and push back on, I think.
Yeah, completely. And this isn't new, right? I think this
No.
right, exactly. So I think there are kind of lessons, or I don't know, things that we can bring back again and say we've been there, we've already talked about this, but I guess taking this expansive notion of design as reconfiguring possibilities, as creating conditions for new worlds to emerge. Then what do you think people can do? I guess that is sort of the question that I was hoping we were.
I wonder if we could open it up, because I'm just you know, aware that we've been going for an hour and everybody's been sitting there, and maybe there are responses to that question.
Maybe they know the answer.
So, or maybe there are other questions.
Yeah, I know. If you know the magic answer, please tell us.
Or any other questions.
Well, before we go to questions, I do want to cover one more kind of like visiting, and I'm sure this is going to come up, but I think speaking of things that are resonant between, you know, history and now, there are many people involved in different types of organizations trying to organize in many ways, right? And given your experience with CPSR, I also wanted to channel that in and think back at what happened. What were the kind of things that emerged from CPSR, and what may have been done differently, and what does that mean for basically a political history that's in a way repeating itself, and the kind of activism or organizing that people are doing or want to do. If you have things that you can share, maybe that can also be another topic of discussion in the mix.
So let me say a few words about that. in regard to CPSR. I mean, if you're going to have an activist organization, you need to understand where are the possibilities for change that you can make and how do you contribute to those, what they call theory of change in organizational stuff. And there was a clear answer to that from CPSR, which was things are being done which are based on false technological assumptions. They will have some amount of trust, question how much, in people who are experts in that technology. That's why the word professionals. I was in an organization in Boston before I moved out here called Computer People for Peace. And it was in the 60s, populist, leftist kind of mold. And computer people saying you should do this or shouldn't do that doesn't have the same weight as computer professionals. That's why we got things like educators and scientists and doctors and so on for social responsibility. So our model was apply our reputation, the gravitas we carry by being professionals to convincing people that they should or shouldn't do certain things. That's a very particular kind of activism. I mean, that's not how everything gets done, right? But that was where the niche that we found most appropriate for what we were doing. So if you're saying what's the lesson for today, I think the lesson is very broad, which is try to understand what the niche is that you and your organization can actually fill. I just ran across, literally in the last day, reading in the popular press about stuff, Trump, or the White House, however you say it, put out a plan called the Plan for Artificial Intelligence or something like that. And there was a group which had like 80 organizations as a coalition. I don't know if you know this group, which is called the People's Plan for Artificial Intelligence. And it was, at one level, it's a great idea. I mean, you say, okay, all the people who care about this aren't the military and the government. But then the next question, I couldn't find an answer to when I read on the web, I'm sure I could ask an AI or something, but is what do you do about that? I mean, having 80 organizations on a list is a starting point, but it's not an answer. And so that's the question for organizing. Where is the leverage?
Right, so I have a great segue to that because I think some of the organizations on that list, one of them was the AI Now Institute, which some of you may know, which I'm involved with, and I think Data and Society, and so I think all of the organizations, or most of the organizations in that list, are people who are pretty deeply embedded in these technical worlds and conversations and debates, and that it is a kind of coalition that came together to try to think through what would an alternative AI plan look like. And in a way, because periodically the question comes up whether CPSR CPSR doesn't exist anymore, and do we need a CPSR? And my feeling is actually now there's a whole ecosystem of organizations, of coalitions, and that what we need are synergies across that ecosystem. And so I'm very involved with the AI Now Institute. I'm involved in something called the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, which is basically working for a treaty banning lethal autonomous weapon systems, mostly working through the United Nations. And part of the reason I'm involved in both of those is that I think they're working in very different, just like you were saying, Terry, that very specifically positioned different sort of mobilizations of expertise, engagement with different debates, and that we need a lot of differently located and differently informed modes of activist scholar activism, activist organizations to address the various dimensions of what we're up against in terms of labor, in terms of militarism and so forth. So.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I think maybe it's a good time to start with questions. There is this Slido in addition to the questions in the room. Maybe you can the person in white can start with your question. And then for the online audience and the in-person audience, you can all use Slido. We have Belicia and Lindsay on Zoom, who are both helping reading out those questions. So we'll be alternating between the room and Slido.
Thank you. This is a commentary of a question. I hope both are short. For the commentary, in 2014, I was a student of human-computer interaction working in autonomous car. And I asked my teacher, how do you work with something that doesn't exist yet? And she told me, which I think is a reflection I take from here, even when the technology changed, human needs one. So you might have autonomous cars, but people still need to move from A to B. They still get sick. They still need love, right? So I think what I'm hearing today is like, yes, AI technologies have changed, but we still have the same friction and the same needs that we have 20 years ago, and we will have the same in 20 years, right? So that's a bit of a reflection. And then the question, as somebody that is working in UX research for adoption of AI, I'm going to pick in something that you said, Lucy, that when you work in this new topic, you decided, let's start a reading book club in the company. So as somebody that wants to start some critical thinking about how we adopt technology, the question for the three of you is there one book that you will recommend for this reading group in my company?
Ooh, that's a hard question.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I mean, I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts. One is a book that I've read very recently, The Eye of the Master by Matteo Pasquinelli. It's a social history of AI. I think it's really enlightening, and the through line there is really about labor and automation, yeah. And then I had another one in mind, but now it's escaped me. So But so where would the reading group, what would you start with? Yeah. And depending on whether, if the interest was in military technologies, I would definitely recommend Paul Edwards' Closed World. Climate, you could start with A Vast Machine if you're doing an Edwards reading group, which would not be a bad thing to do. Yeah, maybe other people have other suggestions.
I don't have a quick answer to that. I mean, when people say they want to learn about it, there's different aspects. So one question would be, what's a good book for understanding what the technology is from not so political perspective, but just to have a background in that. And then the other would be the kinds of things you're saying. Give me time, I'll put together a list, I'll be glad to send it out.
I would also really recommend Melanie Mitchell's Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans.
Yeah,
it's a great
that was
book.
one I was thinking of.
Yeah, and I would say that I also would encourage to think about things that are not directly writing about technology necessarily, like Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blazer's book on the world of many worlds, right? It gives you possibilities to think about and apply, to think about things differently and not just...
Yeah. Right, or see, now they're all coming to me. Arturo Escobar's designs for the pluriverse
Yes.
is a really, and also Joseph Weizenbaum. Like, we should all be rereading Computer Power and Human Reasoning, and and bringing exactly these kinds of questions. Okay, in what ways was Weizenbaum writing in a context that's so different that it's no longer relevant, and in what ways are the things that he's identifying as, if not more relevant now than they were when he wrote the book? But I think that's so important, because so many things that we think have not been said or are just being thought, actually have been articulated so beautifully. And I think Weizenbaum is just an essential resource at the moment.
Hi, my name is Bogdana. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And I'm actually, this question is actually literally about the title, because I'm obsessed with thinking about friction in the context of AI. So I'm very curious about, how do you define friction? What is it really? And then what makes friction generative in a way that is constructive and synergistic, rather than the kinds of doomsday scenarios or despair that are challenging to face? Thank you.
So you made the title. So I mean, I would say, in the sense that you sort of implied it, I don't think there was much friction between us. I think we were pretty smoothly together. But it's a bigger question about how you get along in a society. And there's two bad models. One is conformity, everybody has to agree, and the other is we fight.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
the idea of friction is that you rub against each other, but you don't bash each other, right? And through that, to be metaphorical, you create warmth, right? So that's my take on the word friction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think this was partly inspired by the fact that this debate that Nava mentioned that Terry and I had in the CSCW journal around the coordinator on that system. And I think we had some real, disagreements or different ways of thinking about what was going on there. But that was in the context of connections, I think existing connections that through which we knew that we shared such central kinds of values and sensibilities. And so, yeah, it's a disagreement, but within a respectful kind of interchange. And so that's, I think, the sense of generative frictions or critique, right? I think generative critique, I think about in a similar way, that we get away from the sort of polarization of either you're doing critique or you're doing something constructive. And we actually see critique itself as generative, which I definitely do, right?
Yeah, just one on the metaphor, since we're on metaphors. I mean, if there's a lot of friction for something, sometimes the right answer is step back, lift off, right? Then all of a sudden you're not friction anymore, you're seeing it from a different point of view. Yeah. And that's the coordinator thing, I think, was a perfect example of that.
Awesome. Hi, professors. My name is Annika. I'm an undergraduate student. And you'd mentioned how in the current state of where AI is, there's this fictional hope that it'll save us, especially where we are, as you mentioned, with the United States and the great power competition with China. What do you think are the questions that the government isn't asking? And how might that differ from the industry and the people that are developing these lethal autonomous weapon systems?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think arms races are always in the interest of those who stand to profit from the acceleration of the investment in the relevant technologies to the race, right? And now we're talking about a kind of arms race format for thinking about the development of AI, the competition between the US and China in the development of AI. And I think this is not an area that I'm an expert in, but I think there are people looking very closely at what's actually going on in the US, what's going on in China, what are the points of actually, where there's much more actually shared interest than conflict. Where are the real points of conflict? What would it mean to de-escalate this, race between the U.S. and China? So I think we have to look at that premise that we're in an existential, crisis in relation to American competitive advantage, and really examine kind of how else that might be, what other kinds of analyses might be brought to the current economic situation in relation to China and AI. So yeah, I mean, that's my immediate thought about that.
Go ahead.
Hi, for Professor Suchman, there is an online question asking to hear the story about your sticker.
Oh, okay, yes, I invited that, didn't I? Yes. So this sticker was recently given to me, and there are sort of two aspects to it. One is that AI is in quotes, and the other is the not inevitable. I think maybe this is partly inspired by a paper. I was recently invited to contribute to a collection on AI controversies in the Data and Society Journal. And so I wrote a sort of comment piece titled "The Uncontroversial Thingness of AI." where I actually said, okay, what I'm going to worry about is how it came to be that AI has assumed this status of being a kind of agential thing rather than a collection of technologies, techniques, practices, et cetera. So how might we question the figure of AI itself, not to dismiss it, but to demystify it, to understand what are we actually talking about when we're talking about AI. So that's a part of it. And then the not inevitable part is really a kind of pushback on the discourses of inevitability and what work they're doing and in whose interests they're working, and thinking against technological determinism. Yes, AI has an enormous, there's an enormous inbuilt investment, but it's not inevitable in the sense that we need to continue to ask the question of again, what are the investments in AI and what are the opportunity costs? What's being kind of pushed out of consideration, treated as, there's kind of the inevitable, and then there's, oh, well, that's, not realistic. And that discourse itself, I think, really sets up a kind of limit on what we can imagine, as you keep saying, Nava. So that's the sense of, sort of asserting this non-inevitability of whatever AI is.
I just want to, in that context, bring back a quote from the old days, excuse me, of CPSR, which was, we had a bumper sticker, actually. Technology is driving the future. Who's doing the steering?
Exactly.
Right, and that's it. I mean, it's inevitable in some sense of driving, but
right.
You need to steer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm Zio, and I want to actually, I have prepared a question, but it happens to actually catch with what you exactly are talking about. Technology is basically going forward. Who is steering it, whether it's human or AI? So, especially since they are actually very familiar, if not a pioneer of the old-fashioned AI, we've actually saw people thinking about things not from a pre-prepared data-driven perspective. So we have things like reinforcement learning. We have people developing agents that tries to understand what is interesting, we call that explore versus exploit. And there are still people looking to this field of research to try to let AI or agents, or to say the related technology, understand that what is important, instead of having to push 1 trillion tokens of text into the pre-prepared data set. But as you have already mentioned, clearly nowadays, that camp of thinking, which asks for all the data to be prepared, high quality, a lot of people curating it, that camp seems to be winning. So I want to hear from you about your thoughts, especially from the good old days. How do you think of it? Do you think, especially on symbolic perspective, is it a need for us to have AI understand concretely what is happening structurally? Thank you.
Yeah, I also wrote something recently with the title, There is no technology outside of human relations. So I don't separate, to me, technology as such doesn't do anything. It's always, technologies are always activated, implemented, take their consequence in and through their relations with us. So I actually don't think the careful data curation is winning. On the contrary, my concern is that what's winning is the more data. We need more data, we need more compute power, we need more data centers, and if we just use this sort of combination of primitive forms of profiling and categorization, brute force compute power, incredibly sophisticated algorithmic translations, that something good will come out the end, and that's where I think we really need to actually resist and raise some questions.
Hi, my name's Shim. I'm a sixth year at Berkeley. Thank you so much for this conversation and the knowledge we are generating. I wanted to ask a question that kind of piggybacks off of what you were talking about with regard to like what we're designing, what we're considering inevitable, and the kind of interests it served. So something I've been struggling a lot with is with AI and how it's gendered, and how like even starting with like Siri and Alexa being women, and then wanting to recreate the movie Her, and using Scarlett Johansson's image. And now that I think that a great deal of what we're using the image makers for is to generate something like women, and maybe getting further and further from women. And it's just something that I've been thinking about because I do research on art and image generation. And kind of an attitude around that is, well, that's inevitable. That's what people are going to use this for. That's what media and even paintings have been used long for. And I don't know if I have a way of articulating the question, but I wonder if there's a way that you think about things like this and other ways that AI is being used to perpetuate things like the exploitation of women, but also just things that are exploitative in society. And if there's really a way that us who work on this technology can do more than just ignoring it as inevitable.
Yeah. I mean, I think in this respect, these technologies are kind of disclosing agents for, they amplify the already existing formations of, and I think thinking of it in what's called an intersectional way is really important here. It's gender, it's race, it's class. So, whether things are figured, how they're gendered, whether they're figured as servants, which is of course massively the case, the dream is that we're all going to live upstairs instead of downstairs, and we don't have to feel guilty because the downstairs is all bots instead of humans, and so we see all of the long-standing social orderings being amplified, and I think we have to call that out. Try to intervene in that in various ways, but first and foremost, kind of recognize that that's what's happening, right? And the so-called most innovative technologies are reproducing some of the most sort of regressive forms of thinking about our social relations and the kind of worlds that we want to inhabit. And, yeah.
Let me just broaden that out slightly. I mean, if you look at issues like the loss of trust in institutions, the loss of trust in what you see and hear and so on. AI didn't cause those. And the metaphor I use is it's not a cause, it's an accelerant, right? I mean, it's throwing fuel on the fire, but the fire was already there. And I think the things you mentioned, that's true for as well.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm just referring back to the book. It's called The Design of Everyday Things by Norman Wood. I remember taking systems engineering and just this individual who went across Europe and looked at our everyday design. And so, for example, our phones and how ergonomics and human-centered, it was the technology that was created first versus human factors. And so, and then another thing, I'm thinking of the movie when you bring up military, Dr. Strangelove. And so how scary that was, but, and some indicate that indicative of real events in some cases, but also globally, how other countries, because Norman Wood looked at the designs in Europe. I look at China also. I think an individual brought it up earlier. I think a decade earlier, this model got a fine in the mail for jaywalking, and they wondered, okay, what's going on? She wasn't anywhere to be found around that area. Well, there was a bus with her picture, and the algorithms caught her walking across the street, but that was a picture. And so that just goes to show you the algorithm going wrong and depicting. So I guess my question is, what do you see, just because we're in this global interdependence, not only with systems design, but human-centered artificial intelligence, how do you see other countries, whether in Europe or sometimes you see they're more advanced than the United States in terms of design? I guess the question is, what kind of differences do you see on just the human? I know we focus on AI and technology, but I'm looking at the human-centered piece. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I think in terms of the kind of regulatory structures and the conversations going on around the regulation of AI in the public interest, that Europe has gone further than the US. At the US, there are enormous constraints, and on the US is a very anti-regulatory society in many ways, and for better and worse. But in this case, I think those conversations haven't been able to develop as much. But it's not really an area that I'm very knowledgeable about.
Yeah, I basically echo that.
Hi, my name is Pahal. I'm a high school student, and I actually had a question about like AGIs because I've been like researching on those lately, and I understand that like human understanding would be a mix of, let's say, like critical knowledge and like emotional intelligence, and with AGIs, companies are trying to mimic human understanding. So, do you think that will ever be possible? Like, do you think machines and artificial intelligence could ever reach like a point where it mimics emotional intelligence as well as like critical understanding? Thank you.
I would just start off by saying you used the key word, right? Mimic. That is, that it doesn't have intelligence, it doesn't have emotions. It can mimic, and again, Eliza did this, right? So much simpler systems can do this to some extent. It mimics what you would expect from a person who had emotions. And it's getting more sophisticated and subtle at doing that. Will it ever, quote, have emotions? No, I think that's just a category mismatch. But will it be successful enough to fool people? Absolutely. I mean, you can read all the popular press about people who get involved with their chatbots. And if you said to them, is it emotional? They would say, well, of course, right? I mean, look at what it said and look what it did and so on. Because it's mimicking that so well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm an AGI skeptic, to put it mildly, and for a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about, and I would go in the opposite direction of much more domain-specific applications, and I think the whole sort of project of AGI is a very, very long-standing kind of very compelling fantasy for a lot of people. But I don't think we're any closer to AGI now than we ever have been in the history of creating human-like machines, basically.
Another quote I like to use along with the give a damn quote is my advisor at MIT, Marvin Minsky, who said, I believe in the mid-60s, I don't have the exact date, I have my paper somewhere, within 10 years, computers will be as intelligent as we are and more so, and if we're lucky, they'll keep us as pets. Yeah. Right? That was 50 years ago. But I agree. I'm a skeptic as to achieving that level. I'm going to say a worrier as opposed to a skeptic about people making the assumption that it has.
We're at time, so I just wanted to make sure I'm respectful of everyone's time. I wanted to thank you both once again for being here. It is such an honor to be having this conversation with you both, and I'm sure there will be opportunities for continuing the conversation. We have a reception now for the next hour, so please stick around, have conversations, and thank you both
and
again.
Thank you for organizing us.